spring of 1942, the Second World War took a subtle but significantly new and terrifying turn on both the German and the British sides. Bombs were targeted not just at warships and factories, at fortifications and airfields, but at ancient or historic towns with their cathedrals, city squares and medieval streets. Culture and history suddenly came right into the firing line. And to help them choose their targets, Hitler's High Command declared that they were going to use this book, Baedecker's Guide to Great Britain.
Herr Hitler himself has been good enough to mingle terrible threats with his whinings. He warns us solemnly that if we go on smashing up the German cities, his war factories and his bases, he will retaliate against our cathedrals and historic monuments.
The guides published by the Leipzig firm of Karl Baedecker since 1827 were widely used before the Second World War and the age of mass tourism. As well as tips for the traveller, they provided a scholarly account of the nation's architecture, marking outstanding examples with a series of stars.
Baedecker liked this place. The College of the Vicars Choral in Exeter is, he says, 15th century, well in fact it's 14th century, but with a fine hall containing linen fold panelling and portraits of bishops, here at number 11 next door. But this is all that's left after bombing in 1942. The high table would have stood over there, lit by these splendid decorated Gothic windows with their cusped arches. Panelling would have covered the walls here. And the recesses in the masonry remind us that above all would have soared a splendid timber roof.
The months leading up to the air attacks on historic English cities were pivotal in the conduct of the war. The so-called Baedecker raids were a response to a new British policy. Churchill looked increasingly to the heavy bombers of the RAF to strike a significant blow against Germany. But for Bomber Command to achieve that aim, a dramatic change of strategy was called for.
What the RAF decided at the end of 1941 was that since the average bomber crew was simply not capable with the navigational and bombing equipment they possessed of hitting a specific factory, a specific dockyard, a specific target, they had to send them out every night to attack the smallest target they were capable of finding. And the answer to that was a city.
Press home your attack. If you individually succeed, you will have delivered the most devastating blow against the very vitals of the enemy. Let him have it right on the chin.
What he wanted was some visible big successes, and he was less concerned in the first stages about achieving major damage to German industry than he was to building up the confidence and the reputation of Bomber Command, to making the bomber crews themselves, who become very despondent in 1941 by the failures they knew had been going on, to make them feel that they were capable of finding and effectively attacking targets in Germany.
At the now deserted bases of Bomber Command in northern and eastern England, men gathered to put the new policy to the test.
On airfields all over Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and East Anglia, on the night of the 28th of March 1942, the crews of 234 aircraft of Bomber Command received their final briefing. The target chosen for that night was Lübeck.
Lübeck, das Nürnberg des Nordens. In den Bauten dieser alten deutschen Stadt mit ihren ragenden gotischen Türmen und mittelalterlichen Giebeldächern dokumentiert sich der Kulturwille eines stolzen Hanseatentums. Die Kirchen, die Patrizierhäuser und das Rathaus von Lübeck gehören zu den kostbarsten Baudenkmälern der Welt.
When we went into briefing as normal, preliminary briefing, and the wing commander stood up and said, "Well, boys, the gloves are off." And we wondered what the hell he was talking about, and he said, "Tonight the target is Lübeck town." And we were really rather relieved, because it meant we didn't have to muck around the target looking for a specific aiming point. And it was going to be a reasonably easy one to find because it was on the coast. And also, during the briefing as it developed, we were told it was a town with a lot of wooden houses in, which would burn easily.
Most of the streets, too, have been untouched by the passage of time, and some of the houses in them were built in the 13th century, like this one with its quaint veranda.
This is what I wrote about the Lübeck raid the following morning. A real old-fashioned Blitz on a residential come factory area. Bags of old houses which are supposed to burn like buggery. We ran in on Lübeck at about 11,000 feet. The old town was already one mass of flames, so we turned our attentions to the factory area northwest on the other side of the river. There was a little heavy flak and some light flak, and we started some lovely fires and left them burning well.
In einem militärisch und wirtschaftlich völlig sinnlosen Luftangriff legten die Engländer mit Brand- und Sprengbomben einen Teil der Altstadt in Trümmer und vernichteten dabei weltberühmte Kunstschätze. Der Dom, ein Bauwerk aus dem 12. Jahrhundert. Seine 120 Meter...
Harris sought to choose targets that he was sure that the RAF could effectively destroy. And given that targets on the coast were easier to find for navigators than targets inland, he wanted some big successes for Bomber Command, so his first big successes of his regime were the attacks on Rostock and Lübeck, two coastal ports of whose industrial importance was frankly pretty limited, but as he himself put it in his memoirs, because they were old medieval Hansa towns, they were built more like firelighters, to use his phrase, than human habitations.
The devastation of Lübeck aroused fierce indignation in the German High Command. Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, made this entry in his secret diary.
Our task now must be to reply to terror with terror, and to respond to the attempted destruction of German centres of culture by raising English cultural shrines to the ground. That is now to be done on the biggest scale possible.
On the 27th of April, Baron Gustav Braun von Stumm of the German Foreign Office declared in an unguarded moment,
"From now on, we will go for targets marked with 3 stars in the Baedecker Guide."
In fact, Baedecker never awarded any site or building more than 2 stars, but von Stumm's remark was picked up by the Times, and the Baedecker Blitz was born. The first target was Exeter. This is what Exeter was like before bombs burnt and blasted the heart out of the city in May 1942. The buildings are tall, various dates, some ancient, mostly with plaster front and mostly of timber construction. Behind me is the Guildhall, a magnificent building. Baedecker liked it. He called it quaint. Elaborate facade, 1593. He gave it 1 star. Pre-war Exeter was an extraordinary city, with a high street, a memory of the Roman urban plan, snaking through a tight mix of medieval buildings and alleys. The cathedral reposing in its secluded close, and, on the periphery, the elegant late Georgian New Town, with the oval of Bedford Circus at its centre. The edition of Baedecker's Guide current in 1942 asserts that, where English architecture is indisputably supreme, is in the design of the simple, dignified townhouse deriving from the Georgian period. This time Baedecker's absolutely spot on. This is Barnfield Crescent in Exeter, designed in the 1790s, and is a wonderful example of late Georgian domestic architecture. Noble in design, large in scale, refined in detail. If you look here, this is tuck pointing. The final refinement is excellent brickwork. Lime putty is laid over the actual joints to reduce them in size, to make them look smaller, to make the whole thing look more expensive. Wonderful craftsmanship. Look at the brick arches. Incredibly well-cut brick, making the whole thing really sing as a piece of architecture. Exeter was particularly rich in this type of late Georgian building until the morning of the 4th of May 1942.
Of course, Exeter was a sitting target. Just a quiet cathedral city, and the Hun was able to do his worst. By the time he'd finished, the place was well ablaze.
We had no idea when it started how awful it was all going to be, and we were quite a number here, but it all happened so quickly. The siren went, and within 10 minutes flares came down, and shortly after that down came 10,000 incendiaries gradually, hundreds at a time, and then the heavy stuff came down. It was a most terrifying night, partly because we were up at this height, and the blast of bombs dropping was so fearful we could have been blown out over at any moment.
This morning I picked my way along through the ruined streets. I saw many of the city's churches completely gutted out, and hospitals and schools and colleges had suffered badly too. Exeter's always been known for the beauty of its squares and crescents and circuses. Many of them today were just groups of bare, blackened masonry.
The High Street was decimated. The medieval Vicar's Choral was gutted by fire. So too was the Globe Hotel in the Cathedral Close, and Della's Cafe, the social heart of the pre-war city, was reduced to a shambling wreck.
It wasn't only historic buildings that took the brunt of the Baedecker Blitz, but also ordinary homes where ordinary people lived. I'm standing in Portland Street, Exeter, looking at a photograph taken really where I'm standing now. I can see from this that quite clearly a bomb fell in the middle of the road, wrecking buildings on each side. Every time one sees a gap in a terrace like this, or awkward infill houses, the chances are that an ordinary family was killed here, injured or made homeless.
Because Exeter was beautiful, it was bombed. And because it was bombed, people died. 241 of them in 3 separate raids.
The King and Queen have come to see how Bath now takes its place in Hitler's plan of war. Once again, the distortion...
Von Sturm's unauthorized reference to Baedecker was to prove an embarrassment for Goebbels. As the raids gathered momentum, the propaganda war took off, with the British ridiculing the idea of a guidebook Blitz.
And to revenge the huge losses to their war machine which we cause, the Germans turn the pages of a traveller's reference book and pick out our beauty spots and historic landmarks for destruction. Bath is famous for both. While they may concentrate their bombers on targets suggested by Mr. Baedecker, the RAF will continue to open up the second front in the skies over Germany.
Nazi broadcasts of Britain struggled to regain control over public perception of the raids.
Bath is, as its name says, the fashionable spa of England. For more than 100 years, it has been the gathering place of so-called English good society. The radioactive springs are effective against rheumatism and gout, but only the British money aristocracy could afford to visit the bathing facilities and springs of Bath. By these destructive reprisal raids, the British plutocrats are hit. The same people who are responsible for the British terror raids on old German cultural centres.
Bath's Royal Crescent was damaged by incendiaries. Lansdowne Crescent was scarred by shrapnel, and the assembly rooms were consumed by fire. The city's architectural coherence meant that these missing parts were soon replaced after the war, but other Baedecker targets were not to be so fortunate.
The next centre of culture to be attacked, supposedly plucked from Baedecker, was Norwich, bombed 2 days after Bath. The Daily Mail of Wednesday, the 29th of April 1942 headlines the story, Baedecker bombers go to Norwich, fail, 3-star buildings all escape.
But German bombers returned to Norwich that same night, although damage was less severe than in Exeter and Bath. The raids prompted a flood of anxious letters to the Ministry of Information. Had German radio and its most famous propagandist, Lord Haw Haw, threatened their particular pleasant and historic town?
Could you advise me if Haw Haw has put over any threats regarding Cheltenham? I'd like to be in a
Did Lord
position
Haw
to
Haw
squash
say they had
my-
not forgotten Ipswich?
Whether anybody
These sort
has
of rumours
first-hand
make
knowledge
people
of threats regarding Budley Salterton and the Hotel Rosemullion in particular.
When the Baedecker raids first started, the British cities that were bombed had basically not had a bomb on them at all so far, and there was certainly a degree of malicious pleasure coming from some quarters that finally these places were being hit. For example, a woman who had been in the Mersey Blitz and wrote a diary which is in the Mass Observation Archive saying, at last the middle and upper class evacuees, the people who managed to buy their way into comfortable quarters in places such as Bath, are finally seeing what air raids are like.
Closely packed, narrow streets of ancient, tottering, timber-framed buildings, more like firelighters than human habitations, one could say. Clearly a fire raiser's dream, and all packed within an ancient city wall and presided over by one of the greatest Gothic buildings in Europe. York was clearly an ideal Baedecker target.
The raid on York began when the 10:15 train from London, Edinburgh, came onto this very rail here. At that very instance, German planes swooped down on the station itself, machine gunning and dropping fire bombs, and suddenly all hell broke loose. I came here to the station then as a schoolboy, 50-year-old schoolboy, some 6 hours afterwards, after the raid had started. It was packed with hose pipes and firemen and engines and ambulances. Smoke was still coming up, and I think it was still, if I recollect correctly, still bringing out casualties.
The railway station was the first target in the Baedecker raid on York, but wandering planes scattered bombs over several parts of the city centre.
Clusters of firebombs fell right across this area, the riverside centre of the ancient city. Ahead of us is the Guildhall, a major medieval building completed in 1446. Indeed, in April 1942, the oldest surviving Guildhall in Britain. Firebombs fell on its roof. The first ones were booted off by the fire watchers. Firebombs also fell on round trees behind us in 1942, packed with cocoa and sugar, those raw materials York's greatest export. Fireboats came up here, roughly where we are now, and played their hoses on the Guildhall in an attempt to put out the flames raging inside. Unfortunately, molten lead boiling into the water, the heat of the burning oak interior forced the fireboats back. They could do no more to help. By the morning, both these buildings, the Guildhall and Roundtrees, were sad, gutted shells.
The Guildhall's oak interior was burnt beyond repair, but it could be rebuilt in traditional manner and materials, and its blackened facade could be cleaned. The nearby church of St. Martin le Grand, admired by Baedecker, was not so lucky. The nave and one aisle were gutted by fire. The surviving shell, with its splendid traceried east window, was unfortunately dismantled after the war. Only a stub of a building now survives on the site.
I'm standing on the York City Wall. Ahead of me is the Bar Convent, founded in 1686. It's the oldest convent school in Britain. Currently it's housed in rather splendid mid-18th century buildings, but looking at the building right ahead of us, yellow bricks grafted onto an older structure, I would say something pretty dramatic has happened here in the recent past.
Well, a bomb fell there. It blew off the entire corner of that building, as you can see by the new bricks, and virtually destroyed this wing. It had to be replaced entirely.
And when that bomb fell, what happened to the people in the building?
Well, some nuns were going to rescue a very old blind nun who was at the end of the infirmary wing, and as they were coming back, one of them fell into a bomb crater. Unfortunately, she fell onto the bomb that had made the hole. She said she could hear it ticking. She knew she was sitting on the bomb, but she'd broken her leg. And while the others were going to fetch her a ladder so as to rescue her, the bomb exploded and 5 of them were killed.
A total of 79 people died in the Baedecker raid on York. But while a church, schools and houses were damaged and destroyed, the minster escaped.
The minster is the heart of York. There's been a Christian church on this site since the 7th century, and before that the Roman 6th Legion had its headquarters right here. Baedecker gives the minster 2 stars. He says in original stained glass, York Minster excels all other English cathedrals. Well, this is high praise indeed from the sternly dispassionate Herr Baedecker. But the question is, in 1942, was the Minster a target? The people of York certainly thought it was. The BBC received a furious telegram from the Mayor of York when it announced that the Minster was unharmed. Was this not simply an invitation to the bombers to return? The incident highlighted the propaganda pitfalls of attacks on history and culture.
The Germans had bombed Coventry in 1940 perfectly legitimately. The British cabinet had accepted this because it was a major industrial centre. Some incendiaries had fallen on the cathedral. This had then become the main focus of the British propaganda afterwards. It was the first time we actually talked up a raid and admitted how much damage had actually been caused. With the Baedecker cities, obviously a number of cathedrals did suffer some damage. The Germans were never quite sure how to put this across in their broadcasts and in their newspapers. They would claim with York, we deliberately avoided bombing the Minster. Certainly, a lot of locals in many cities were quite convinced that the cathedrals were particularly targeted.
But Exeter Cathedral was hit. The south aisles of the choir and a chapel were split apart by a high-explosive bomb.
There was one object in our minds during the war, and that was to keep alive. And if anything was going to prevent us being kept alive, that thing had to be removed, you see, and that's how a lot of people thought. On May the 5th, following the Great Raid, I've heard people myself say, with a great amount of hostility, the sooner they blow up what remains of the cathedral, the sooner our raids will cease. It was widespread. A great number of people believed that the centre of Hitler's attraction was the cathedral, and he was out to destroy it. And he nearly did.
It would appear that the German reprisal attacks have made official...
It was precisely such uncertainty and fear that German propaganda sought to exploit.
Baedecker betting is the latest amusement on the stock exchange.
A list of odds issued on the notepaper of a well-known London stockbroker has just reached us. It bears today's date and deals with the raids of the next few hours. First on the list is York, the chances being only 3-1 against its being blitzed again tonight. The second favourite is Norwich, odds 4-1 against. Canterbury and Salisbury, 6-1. Then came Bath, Tunbridge Wells, and a number of outsiders.
But the stakes were increased dramatically when Harris launched the first 1,000-bomber raid on the night of the 30th of May. The target was Cologne. It was a vivid demonstration of the increasing strength of Bomber Command and a powerful piece of military theatre. It also brought death to nearly 500 citizens and the complete destruction of over 600 acres of the city. The attack provoked a furious reprisal.
The final Baedecker raid came in the early hours of the 1st of June 1942, when nearly 80 German bombers attacked Canterbury for 1¼ hours. The cathedral wasn't hit, although a bomb did fall right behind me here on the Victorian Library, rebuilt since the war, and a lot of high explosive and incendiary bombs did do a great deal of damage to the town's historic centre.
Canterbury, one of the main seats of British arch-hypocrisy, had to atone last night for the assault on the ancient and magnificent town of Cologne. Canterbury is the seat of the primate of the English High Church, notorious for his incitement campaign against Germany. Buildings which had stood for centuries became prey to the flames which raged through the narrow streets. Every Blitz blow rocking this town is retaliation. Vengeance for Cologne.
Look at these pre-war pictures of Canterbury, a quiet little English town of less than 25,000 inhabitants, bombed as reprisal for an attack on a mighty German city of first importance to the Nazi war machine. That's the Nazi mentality. Canterbury for Cologne. It's fantastic.
The Baedecker raids drew a great deal of attention, and I think convinced Hitler that the Germans could still strike back. If you're going for cities which have never been bombed before, then obviously there's going to be a much higher press profile than if you just went back to London again. In terms of military damage, they merely showed how little the Germans could strike back.
with most of their air force by then deployed on the Eastern Front, all they could do was an almost crude, yes, it was a rather barbaric gesture to say, right, we can't hit the things that matter in Britain, but what we can do is destroy or damage some of your centres of beauty.
After the war, Lübeck, the city where the first experiment in area bombing was conducted, was restored with meticulous care. Its famous Marienkirche, severely damaged in 1942, now dominates the skyline again. In Britain, however, we hasten to complete what the Baedecker bombers had begun. Buildings of recognised historic interest which had only been damaged by bombs and which could have been repaired were simply demolished. But what became of Exeter's Georgian gem, Bedford Circus?
A lot did survive the bombing of 1942. The chapel was intact and the flanking wing, one of the flanking wings was intact. And one can see from this picture that fire bombs have destroyed the interior, but the door cases survived, the ironwork's still there, the parapet's still there, the chimney stack's still there. It wasn't German firebombs that destroyed Bedford Circus, it was the authorities in Exeter who decided not to rebuild it. They decided rather to clear it away, to pretend it had never existed.
Local politicians and planners had a vision of a bright, new and hygienic city of wide and airy streets with different uses segregated into their own precincts. But the overwhelming reality of that vision is this: streets designed for cars, not people. Banal and characterless office blocks and shed-like flat-roofed shops. Exeter's fate was shared after the war by towns all over Britain.
This is the site of the Corn Exchange and Long Market underneath it. It was called Long Market simply because it was a passageway through from one side to the other. The building above had a very, very fine ceiling, but it lost its ceiling. Beyond that, it was perfectly capable of being restored. The facade was splendid. Very, very good example of Regency. Finished in 1825. The whole lot was demolished. The local authority had complete powers to demolish whatever they saw fit. The provision had to be that it was war damaged. Now that was used in some towns where only just the odd tile or so, broken by shrapnel, was used as the excuse for demolition. There was a complete misunderstanding of the value of historic buildings.
Today, England's bombed historic towns are scarred not by rubble but by redevelopment. How many stars would Baedecker award to these post-war versions of the places he once praised?